Susan Olson. I want to thank everybody for joining the educational webinar today provided by Genscape. We've made just a slight adjustment to the title, so if you were coming to see trends in renewable fuel tax incentives, you're in the right place. We expanded the title to renewable energy incentives to be a little bit more all-inclusive of some additional subject matter today. So again, we're providing this webinar to provide some important insight into some of the latest activities in Washington regarding federal tax regulations that affect renewable fuels and the related businesses. So we're providing this webinar as a service for our existing clients and business associates. So we like to try to provide this kind of educational material on policy and regulatory events, so just to help better arm our clients and business associates with information to make the best decisions possible they can for their business. So I'm pleased to introduce today my esteemed business associate, Manning Faraci from Playmaker Strategies. He'll be our featured speaker. Manning has a ton of experience, 20 years or so of experience in the policymaking process, especially as it's related to tax and energy issues, and he successfully navigated this space through the legislative and regulatory process. So he's a real leader in the industry on renewable fuels policy. Prior to founding his firm, Playmaker Strategies, he was a lead lobbyist with both the National Biodiesel Board and Solar Energy Industries Association. And he's also served as Chief of Staff and a Senior Tax Policy Staffer for a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. So it goes without saying that he has a lot of experience with the ins and outs of these tax issues in Washington. So he's had a long career in Capitol Hill, and spent 14 years up there, and then subsequently as a government relations professional, and talked about his NBB and Solar Energy Industries Association lobbying efforts. So just a couple of quick, before I turn it over to Manning and he can talk a little bit about his firm, a couple of quick technical things I wanted to talk to you about today. If you have questions, we certainly appreciate them. We think it adds a lot of color and value to these type of educational topics to hear what you want to hear about. So please feel free to submit your questions using the questions box on the GoToWebinar panel. Just submit your questions by typing them anytime. We'll treat them all anonymously, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. So when you type in a question, nobody will be able to see it except for the staff and organizers of the webinar, and we'll ask the questions and answer questions at the end of the webinar. So today, we know your time is valuable, so I wanted to set some expectations. We expect, somewhere between 30 or 40 minutes or so of material that Manning will present, and that'll be followed by question and answers. So, and also we will be sharing these slides at the end of the webinar, so you will get a copy of the slides, and also we'll share a link to the recording of the webinar. So, well, without further ado, I will hand it over to Manning, and Manning, you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Susan, and I want to thank everybody for calling in to the webinar. Hopefully we're going to have some good content for you to take a look at from both the short-term and perhaps even the longer-term perspective on renewable energy tax incentives. As Susan said, I'm Manning Faraci. I'm a principal with Playmaker Strategies. We are a Washington, D.C.-based government relations firm. We have clients, a variety of clients in the renewable energy space, and we're privileged to work with Genscape, and we think it's great that Genscape does, makes it a priority to keep their clients abreast of what is going on in Washington. As anybody in this space knows right now, there are a multitude of things, both in the legislative and the regulatory realms, that have a direct impact on the bottom lines of any sort of stakeholder in the renewable energy space. And so, I'm happy to be here today to focus on one very specific component of that, and that is federal tax policy, which when you look at it historically from both a renewable fuels and from a renewable electricity perspective, have been huge market movers and had a huge impact on the fates of these industries. And there are clearly things going on right now in Washington that are going to impact these important incentives. And what I want to do today is give you some perspective so that both in the short term and in the longer term you can have an informed perspective and informed expectations about what you're going to be seeing out of Washington, both through the remainder of this Congress, and then, further into when we get past the elections and into the subsequent years, some of the larger trend lines in the presentation. So, Susan, if we could go to the next slide, please. So here's basically what I wanted to go over with you today, and knowing that your time is valuable, and also knowing that we want to give some time at the end to answer questions that may come up during the presentation. I'm going to be pretty concise in going through this, but there's a good bit to go through, and I wanted to lay this out and before we got to the questions part. So it seemed to me to make sense to divide this up into two broad areas. One is to look at what can you expect in the remainder of the 113th Congress, or Q2 through Q4 of this year. So we're going to look at the overall existing biofuels incentives, the tax extender process in both the House and Senate, and some potential outcomes on that. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance. I did not bring my crystal ball with me, but I'll give you my best perspective. Beyond that, we'll look at some of the longer-term trends in federal policy on the tax side, because there's some things I think that would be, trends that I think would be helpful as you're making business decisions and you're thinking about, what to expect in the tax code going forward. There's some trends that are already emerging that I think would be useful for you to be aware of. So, Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so let's start with the first part of the presentation where we talk about what's going on in this Congress. What can you expect through the remainder of the year? Next slide, please. Now, I looked at the attendees who are calling in this, and this is obviously a very knowledgeable group, so I'm not going to go through in great detail what these incentives are and how they're structured, because I'm sure that everyone is very well aware of that. But just a couple items of note here. Obviously, you've got the existing biodiesel, renewable diesel tax incentive, the second generation biofuel producer credit, and the all fuel credit. Noteworthy that the biodiesel credit retains its refundability, which makes it an extremely liquid and useful tax incentive, especially compared to when you look at what you have going on the electricity side, where the big market drivers, the Section 45 PTC, the Section 48 ITC, are income tax credits where you have to have tax equity deals to bring capital into those industries. Also noteworthy, and some of you may remember this from last year, the alt fuel mixture credit, which previously was a blender's credit and refundable in the way that the biodiesel and renewable diesel tax incentive was. Congress made a change at the end of 2012 that restricted the ability to the refundability of that credit, and that was in response to some concerns about potential misapplications or unintended uses of the credit. So, but that's basically what they look like right now, and I think that everyone on this phone call is well aware, on this webinar is well aware. These provisions all expired at the end of 2013. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Hey, Manny, this is Susan. Just before you move on to the next one, could you, just a couple of quick questions. Could you just briefly talk about the difference between a refundable and non-refundable credit? And then the second thing is, could you talk a little bit about the fuels that alternative fuel mixture credit were applicable for?
Sure. So and this is, and Susan, stop me if I start to get too technical on the tax side. Please stop me and feel free to ask these questions because I think it's helpful. So there's a big difference between a refundable tax credit and a non-refundable tax credit. So a general business income tax credit can be used dollar for dollar to offset a tax liability. But to the degree that the tax credit, the value of the tax credit exceeds the tax liability, you can't claim a refund on it or you can't receive a payment from it. So when I talk about the Section 45 production tax credit that applies to renewable electricity, or the Section 48 investment tax credit that applies to renewable electricity as well, mainly solar, those credits are not refundable. So you can claim them to the degree that you have an income tax liability. Contrast that to what you have with the biodiesel and the renewable diesel tax incentive, where if you have a qualifying blend, and to the degree that your tax to the degree that the credit exceeds your excise tax liability, you can receive an actual payment from the Treasury to receive that credit, to represent that credit. So if you think about it, that is a far more liquid tax incentive, pardon the pun with the liquid fuels, but from a liquidity standpoint, that makes that tax credit far more liquid, far more usable, far more, able to be included in pricing and what have you, notwithstanding the uncertainty of the federal process itself. So there's that's a big difference with, the difference between a general business income tax credit and what is often referred to as an excise tax credit or a refundable excise tax credit as you're allowed to claim under biodiesel and renewable diesel right now.
Very helpful. Thank you.
You bet. Okay. So a little bit on the process with extenders here, and for the attendees here and who are very knowledgeable about this space, I mean, you're probably sitting here thinking, okay, haven't I seen this movie before? With tax extenders where you have a provision that that is in law for a little bit, then they retroactively extend and it expires again, and unfortunately that's been the trend line is late, and I thought it would be helpful just to kind of provide some perspectives in terms of why that happens, and why do you even have these temporary provisions, in the tax code. So a couple points I think that bear mentioning. First of all, when you're looking at it from the macro perspective and you're looking at expiring provisions, this is not limited to just biofuels or energy incentives. There are the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is basically the scorekeeper on tax legislation in Congress, has identified 55 provisions in the Internal Revenue Code that expired at the end of 2013. And there's no necessarily rhyme or reason to what exactly sort of tax incentives they are. It's kind of a hodgepodge of policy goals. So, without, speaking to the validity or the wisdom of any of these incentives, you have things like the R&D credit. There's a active financing exception. There's, you've seen some of the ones that perhaps mentioned in the press that are, viewed as more as sort of rifle shot or industry specific, but they all have a constituency, and they all expire, at the end of 2013. Now, why do they do this? And you see this on the slide here. There are a couple different reasons why you have these temporary provisions in the Internal Revenue Code. Now, the first bullet is probably a much bigger consideration than the second one, though the second one does apply. If you are, in the past when Congress was doing tax legislation and they're putting new provisions into the Internal Revenue Code, the score, so what the bill is going to cost, obviously that's an important consideration. And you can put more provisions or reduce the cost of a provision or do both if you make the provision temporary in nature. So it makes sense. If you extend a provision for 1 year or 2 years, it costs less than it does to extend it for 10 years. So to meet budget constraints, it's been a regular practice of Congress to have these temporary expiring provisions. The other thing it does as well is it affords periodic oversight of some of these tax incentives in the tax code. And as I mentioned previously, pertaining to the alt fuel mixture credit, periodically Congress will make sort of tweaks or changes to these various tax incentives. Typically, as you see here on the slide, it's very typical for Congress to consider these extenders, and that's kind of the reference that people have assigned to these group of tax incentives. They'll do the tax extenders typically they'll do them as sort of a single legislative package. And the recent precedent has been actually that there's been retroactive extensions incorporated into larger tax bills. The most recent one that you saw was in 2012. Was a retroactive extension, 1 year forward, 1 year back, of expiring provisions that were included in the larger, what was kind of dubbed the fiscal cliff package. So again, just kind of helpful to provide some sort of perspective in terms of the overall way that these sort of issues are typically dealt with. Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So where is this process right now? Where are we in the tax extender process? So the Senate Finance Committee has a new chairman. The former chairman, Max Baucus, was appointed to be the ambassador to China. Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, has taken over as the chairman. One of the first things he did as chairman is he marked up in the extender package on April 3rd. So, and again, this package, for the most part picked up, they kept a few out, but for the most part picked up this suite of expiring provisions and extended them through 2015. Now, as you see here as well, that on the 15th of this month, they're trying to bring the tax extender package up for consideration in the Senate. And actually, right now, that is technically the pending matter that's before the Senate. Now, you see it says the U.S. Senate failed to invoke cloture on the tax extenders package. Now, so what does that mean? So in Senate procedure, you need to typically have 60 votes to be able to move forward with consideration of a bill. That's simplifying it. When we could spend hours talking about the arcane nature of Senate procedure, but the fact of the matter is you typically need 60 votes to move forward, and the 60 votes weren't there to move forward with cloture on the tax extenders package. Now, this shouldn't be viewed as a commentary or some sort of an opinion on the underlying package, because there are some larger political dynamics that were in play that were far more important in shaping the outcome of that cloture vote as opposed to the underlying tax package. For example, some of you may have seen in the news that Senator Reid made changes to the rules applying to the confirmation of federal appointees nominated by the president. The assertion being that the minority party in the Senate was being obstructionist. Republicans, on the other hand, will view this as is restricting their ability to, in the process, to have their voice heard. Without taking sides in that debate, the outcome has been that you see bills that, if you had an up or down vote of the underlying provisions, would probably enjoy wide support, are going down because of lack of amendments in the process, angst over the way that the Senate rules have been changed, or what have you. Some of you may have been following the energy efficiency bill that the Senate tried to consider in April, and it encountered a similar fate, where it also was unable to get a 60-vote cloture margin, but had it come to a final vote, probably would have been approved by a pretty broad bipartisan majority. So right now, the fate of that Senate, whether the Senate is going to be able to come to sort of an amendment agreement that allows them to get the 60 votes, because you're going to need to have Republican support to do that, and move forward with the package, that remains to be seen. The first cloture vote went down. That wasn't a good sign, but Senator Wyden, Senator Hatch, who from Utah, who's the ranking Republican on the Finance Committee, are continuing to have discussions about this issue, and there is the potential they could work something out, but it's premature at this point to say whether that's going to happen or not. But as you can see here, I thought it worthwhile to mention, the provisions that were in the package that the Senate Finance Committee approved, and showing the bipartisan support for tax extenders. When the Finance Committee did approve it, they approved it on a unanimous voice vote. They didn't even take a record vote on it. But for renewable fuels, it was a fairly good package in that picks up the current law biodiesel and renewable diesel tax incentive through 2015. The other current law biofuel incentives it picks up as well through 2015. And on the, I don't have it on the slide, but on the renewable electricity side, the Section 45 PTC, which is primarily used by wind, but does apply to other technologies, was extended would be extended through 2015 as well. So, Susan, can we go to the next slide? So let's talk about the House of Representatives and their process real quick, because we have a bicameral legislature, and the House obviously has a role in this process, and they are taking what is a pretty unique, from a historic perspective, and different approach to the expiring provisions than what you're seeing applied in the Senate. So in the House, in late April, the Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax writing committee that considers tax legislation, approved 6 different packages, 6 different bills to go through and essentially cherry pick out some of these expiring provisions that are typically done in a package and moved to make those permanent. So just for an example, some of those, you had the R&D credit. There's a couple international provisions, charitable gains, charitable contributions for S-corps, small business expensing, things that enjoyed broad support on the committee, particularly among the Republican members. They passed packages out of the committee, making those individual provisions permanent instead of doing them for a 1 year or 2 year period. You've subsequently seen the House take the R&D tax credit bill, which is, the R&D tax credit is a provision that enjoys broad bipartisan support. They put that provision on the House floor, and it was passed as a freestanding measure. Now, it was interesting to note that when the House passed that package, the administration and the Democratic leadership in the House opposed it because it wasn't offset, and they were concerned about the cost, which, if you go back to the previous rationale that I was explaining why you have temporary provisions, well, the Joint Tax Committee said to take the R&D credit and make it permanent costs $155 billion, and that's, even in Washington standards, that's a fair amount of money. So despite that objection, though, that the House was able to pick up, the House bill did pick up some Democratic support and was approved. It's interesting from a trend line perspective in terms of tax extenders, what this means. So part of the Chairman Camp, Dave Camp from Michigan, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the way he's approaching extenders is meant to dovetail into tax reform down the future and to kind of provide what I think he would say would be more of an honest budget baseline. So if you make this permanent, it's not only is it consistent with a tax reform draft that he introduced, unveiled earlier in the year, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this approach is consistent with his approach on tax reform, and it would, from a scoring perspective, when you get the tax reform down the line, making these permanent would incorporate them in the budget baseline, so that from a scoring perspective, it would make it essentially easier to do tax reform. So that's part of the driving factor in terms of in terms of why they're doing this. And then there is the policy rationale as well, is that permanent tax policy that taxpayers can rely on is obviously preferable to sort of the piecemeal, is it going to be there, is it not going to be there, uncertainty that typically surrounds the extender package. Now, as it applies to renewable electricity, renewable energy, the biofuel tax incentives, they were not included in the initial markups. They weren't included, and I'll talk about this more, they weren't included in the initial draft tax reform plan that Chairman Camp put out, but they did leave open the possibility that, as you go through the remainder of the legislative year, that provisions that weren't addressed in this initial round could be the subject of hearings. You could have subsequent markups of other provisions based on the future conversations among some members of the committee. So, Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So how does this whole thing end up? I mean, what are the potential outcomes here? What could happen? So, and I know that these seem somewhat obvious, but let me kind of walk through this with you. So, one outcome, obviously, is you could have an agreement reached prior to the midterm elections. Now, if the Senate were able to come to some sort of an amendment agreement, there would be multiple procedural ways that they could do this. They could involve what is typically kind of referred to as a ping pong, where they send between the chambers different bills until they arrive on one that is acceptable and send that to the president for signature. You could potentially take one of these freestanding expiring provisions that the House is planning to consider, and you could have a formal conference committee where representatives from both the House and Senate are appointed. They sit down, they reconcile the difference between the two packages, come up with one, and then it's voted on by both chambers. Now, I would handicap that as not being a very likely option, but it is one option that would be available, and it is a very fluid legislative process. So there is the potential that if you could see something like that move forward, if the Republicans and the Democrats in the Senate are able to come up with some sort of an amendment agreement that would allow the extender bill to go forward. But even if they don't, even if the Senate is not able to pass a freestanding tax extenders package, it does not mean the end of the world, or it does not mean that tax extenders are dead for the session, because you could have a situation where, and it's a situation that we've seen here in the recent past, where when you get past the elections and you get to the lame duck session, which have become the norm rather than the exception, you will have you'll have some unfinished business that the Congress needs to deal with. These negotiations tend to involve, senior leadership, committee chairmen. The administration obviously has a play in this as well, and it wouldn't be unprecedented to see a tax extender package get done at in a post-election lame duck session, and there's a number of people who are of that opinion that that's exactly what will happen, and it's not an irrational way of looking at this. Another thing to consider as well is that, for as long as I've been in Washington and been involved in tax legislation, it is certainly not unprecedented for the Senate to use a package that was approved by the Senate Finance Committee but not necessarily approved by the full Senate as its position or its negotiating position in terms of dealing with the House, or in terms of asserting what was going to be inserted, what they want to see in a final package at the end of the day. And as a matter of fact, that's what you saw happen here in the 2012 fiscal cliff package. You had an extender package that had been approved by a bipartisan margin that they essentially airdropped into that final package. Now, another potential option, and one that you can't discount, is that Congress could not address extenders. That could very well be the case, and the provisions could remain lapsed, through the end of the year. And looking at this slide, perhaps I should have put this last bullet first, because as you can tell, by not only by what's going on in the Senate, but just kind of in a larger macro sense, you've got midterm elections coming up, and they're having a huge impact in terms of the legislative process and the way that people are approaching this. Subsequently, once we get past the elections, the results are going to have an impact on this as well. There's two schools of thought. So let's just hypothetically say that that control in the United States Senate switches. The Republicans pick up 6 seats, and they now have control of the Senate for the next Congress. They very well may be in a situation where they want to deal with extenders in their own way once they have control of the gavels. So that's a potential outcome there. Or you could also have a scenario where, okay, they won the majority and they want to clear the decks so that they can start fresh, and okay, well, let's just move extenders off. Again, these are the sort of decisions post-election that that will be made, and no one's making these sort of decisions right now. But they're all possible outcomes on this. And again, like I said earlier in the presentation, I'm sorry I wasn't able to bring my crystal ball with me to tell you exactly how it's going to play out. And as you can see, it's still a fluid situation. But if there's one takeaway from this, is if you're following the process in the Senate, and even if they are unable to come to some sort of an amendment agreement moving forward, it does not necessarily mean that is the end of the day for tax extenders, because the precedent that we've seen previously in the legislative process would tell us otherwise. So, Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So that's an overview in terms of what you can see and what you can expect through the remainder of the year in the legislative process, kind of what I'm calling the short term. What Congress is working on right now in terms of tax extenders. But when Susan and I were talking about this, talking about this webinar and talking about what might be useful for Genscape clients, is to provide a little bit of perspective as well in terms of tax reform and some of the trends that are kind of driving the longer term debate and discussions in Washington, particularly as it applies to federal tax incentives. So. Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So, as I've alluded to earlier in the presentation, both tax writing committees, even though the Senate Finance Committee is chaired by a Democrat in the House, and the Republicans control the House, and it's a Republican chairing the Ways and Means Committee, tax reform is guiding their their actions. Now, they may be addressing it in different ways, but both, there's a bipartisan sentiment moving forward that tax reform is a goal that's worth doing, and that they want to move towards that with the legislation they're considering currently. So as a matter of fact, Senator Wyden, who's the new chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, has been adamant that this is going to be the last extenders package that will serve as the bridge to tax reform in the future. As a matter of fact, as you saw in an earlier slide, the bill is called the Expire Act. So Senator Wyden has made crystal clear his desire to move the tax reform. That's a sentiment that is shared by Senator Hatch, who's the ranking Republican on the Finance Committee as well, and would be presumed to be the chairman if control of the Senate were to flip in the next election. So either way you look at it, there's a desire to do tax reform. No secret as well that Chairman Camp, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, has been working and wants to move towards tax reform. Now, Chairman Camp is not running for re-election, so this will be the end of his term in Congress and as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee at the end of this Congress. But that sentiment, that move towards tax reform, is something that all the potential successors of the Ways and Means Committee, be it Congressman Ryan, be it Congressman Brady, T. Berry, any of the potential successors that would succeed Camp in terms of a general outlook and approach of wanting to move towards tax reform, that's definitely an approach that they share. Now, as you can see here, and again, probably stating the obvious to this group that are a pretty informed group, the chances of Congress considering comprehensive or doing fundamental tax reform before the elections is highly unlikely. But they are going to be doing things between going forward to set the stage for tax reform, and you're seeing that in the way that they're approaching the extenders package. You can expect to have future hearings, particularly on the House side, about tax reform and the fundamental issues about that, and what sort of provisions, preferences in the tax code should stay and which ones should go. Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So, and again, this is not necessarily renewable energy focused per se, but I think it's helpful perspective to kind of give you a good idea. Well, why are they talking about tax reform? I mean, why are the chairman of the Finance Committee, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, why are they looking at this? And there's a number of kind of reasons that the tax reform is getting the good hard look that it is now, and this process is starting to move. One is obvious. I mean, we all, we're not too far removed from April 15th, and I'm sure everyone had fun filling out their tax returns, and the complexity of the current tax code is something that everyone has pointed out is a shortcoming and something that needs to be addressed. So that's one of the things that's driving it. But the second bullet here, economic growth and U.S. international competitiveness, that is one that is a huge driver towards tax reform as well. Right now, the United States, when you look at, we have a 35% corporate tax rate, and that is one of the highest in the entire world. And the world is, from a business perspective, the world is becoming more competitive. There's a school of thought that if we change the way that we tax the operations of U.S. companies doing business abroad, that we will improve job growth and economic opportunity here in the U.S. Now, important to point out that there are very different approaches between what the Republicans want to do on that towards moving towards a territorial tax system versus some of the things that you've seen come out of the Obama administration, which would take a completely different approach. But enhancing economic growth, U.S. international competitiveness, huge drivers in terms of why they're taking a look at tax reform. And then that dovetails into, what I'm calling the long-term fiscal and budget issues, going forward. But it also highlights, they view tax reform as a way to, if you stimulate economic growth, you will generate more revenue. It will help address the budget issues facing the federal government, the long-term structural budget deficits that we have. That when you look at what the Congressional Budget Office has said, you're going to have these problems are going to continue to amplify as the country gets older. And we have demographic changes, and entitlement spending continues to rise. So it's something that they're going to, that from a long-term perspective, Congress, the Congress and elected officials are going to have to address. Now, again, important to point out here that though there is a 30,000-foot level of agreement that, yes, this is a benefit and something that we need to address in tax reform, there is a big difference between the parties on this, where Republicans would prefer to do this in a way that was at minimum revenue neutral in some respects, or even see it be a tax cut, and have the package scored dynamically so that you incorporate the economic growth and benefit that you get from a tax reduction in a tax reform package, whereas Democratic members will tend to support an approach to tax reform that would raise revenue. Use this in a more traditional way that at the end of the day, the Joint Committee comes back and says, passing this package is going to increase overall federal government revenues. So just, again, 30,000-foot level, this is why they're doing it. This is why they're taking such a hard look at tax reform. Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So with that in mind, you've seen there are several proposals and ideas of note that I wanted to flag for everyone, because is it an absolute predictor of what's going to happen in the future? No. But are they noteworthy enough that you can kind of start to see some potential trend lines? They're worth discussing and worth noting. So, for example, let's start with a staff discussion draft that was put out by the former chairman of the Finance Committee before he left to be ambassador to China. Now, I will say that though it was obviously a Baucus staff discussion draft, that other committee members were apprised and were made aware of were made aware of and involved in the formulation of the discussion draft. Now they're not officially wedded to that, but it was something that they wanted to put out there. And again, as the name implies, it's a discussion draft. They wanted to get these ideas out there. They sought public comments and received them. But there's some interesting concepts, particularly as it applies to renewable energy, that provided a little bit of insight, I think, in terms of the mindset, in terms of what some of the members, that particularly the Democratic members on the Senate Finance Committee, how they're approaching tax reform and renewable energy tax incentives within that broader topic. So, first of all, important to note that in this Baucus discussion draft, it maintained in the Internal Revenue Code a long-term tax incentive for both renewable fuel and renewable electricity. In both instances, the presence of the credits were conditioned on achieving larger overall greenhouse gas reductions in the larger economy. So it didn't put like a hard date or make it permanent. It made it based on these larger environmental goals in terms of how long the tax incentives would exist. Now, the assumption is based on looking at the goals that they'd set out in the package, 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, that the incentives would essentially provide a long-term incentive in the Internal Revenue Code, which would be a significant difference than what we have now, which is the sporadic, short-term, even retroactive extensions of renewable energy incentives. And then, beyond that kind of fundamental thing, though, there were two things from a structural perspective that I wanted to note and that I thought was of interest. Both for renewable electricity and for renewable fuels, the credits they're performance-based, and that's a term that the committee staff use. But the eligibility and the credit rates that you're able to get would be based on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, and energy content in the case of fuels. And then the other thing as well is that there's been this long-running goal for a while to try to try to take these multitude of energy tax incentives that you have out there right now and harmonize them or condense them into just one or two, just a few credits, and then make them similar in terms of their policy outcomes. And you saw that reflected in this staff discussion draft that came out from the Democrats on the Senate Finance Committee, in that you had from a tax perspective, you had a very similar structure in that it went to income tax credits, as we discussed earlier, as opposed to refundables. and it picked up a provision out of the Section 45 PTC where you would have a 10-year stream of eligible income tax credits, and then and that would be for new facilities. And again, that mirrors what's in current law, Section 45, and they would put that into, and they would apply that on the renewable fuel side. I didn't put this on the slide, but it would also provide an election to opt for a 20% investment tax credit instead of a 10-year stream of production credits. So, you know, again, is this going to get enacted into law tomorrow? Is this a lot to happen? Absolutely not. But some larger trends that you've seen in this discussion draft that came out from a former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. So, you know, worth noting. Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So, how's the House approaching this? And I alluded to this during the presentation. So, you know, Chairman Camp earlier this year released a very comprehensive discussion draft, tax reform discussion draft. Now, important thing to note just from a process standpoint, you shouldn't look at this package as the official position of the Republican Party or the Republican leadership, or even his successor is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, be it, you know, Congressman Ryan or Congressman Brady, that this is the absolute proposal that they're wedded to. It was a discussion draft, and there were press articles that was noted out there that the leadership was not exactly 100% enamored or 100% supportive of this particular package because there are some controversial components to it. But thematically, what Chairman Camp was doing is trying to take the 7 rates that we had, trying to reduce rates and get rid of different preferences and do that in a way that it was revenue neutral. So very broadly, what his package would have done would have taken the existing 7 individual tax rates and reduced them to 3 rates of 10, 25, and 35%, and then reduced that corporate rate that I was referring to previously from 35% down to 25%. And it does this in a revenue neutral way by eliminating a whole host of tax preferences in the Internal Revenue Code, and it was across the board. And you know, for renewable energy incentives, you know, the fuel incentive, the renewable fuel incentive, the biodiesel, renewable diesel, all fuel, second generation biofuel tax incentive, the Camp discussion draft would assume the repeal of those. It would also assume the expiration, the continued expiration of the Section 45 PTC. It would actually reduce the value of the credit for existing facilities, and then it assumes that the 48 investment tax credit, which expires, the 30% level that expires at the end of 2016, would not be continued. So, you know, again, and I don't want to portray this as, oh, they went out and they're specifically going after renewables in this situation, because if you go on, I mean, you could spend a whole hour going through these specific provisions, but if you go through what Chairman Camp proposed, there was a whole host of tax preferences that are assumed to expire or be repealed. And again, he did that in a way to try to, in a revenue neutral way, reduce corporate tax rates. So can we go to the next slide, please? You know, have to mention where the administration is on this just very briefly now. It's I don't mean to do anything to take away from the importance of the president in this process, because obviously he's the chief executive and would hold huge sway at the point that they start firing with real bullets with tax reform. But at this point, it's not viewed as a huge administration priority, though they did previously reduce a framework for tax reform. And what kind of trends can you pull from that in some of their budget, the most recent budget document that they put forward? Well, on the renewable electricity side, noting the absence of anything like an RFS on the electricity side, they would call for a permanent energy credit that would be refundable. So in terms of the larger debate, the administration's put themselves in a position where they want to continue an incentive for renewable energy, and they're clearly open to the concept of it maintaining refundability, because that's what their proposal would do. They didn't call for an extension of biodiesel renewable diesel tax incentives. You know, again, I think that the RFS, the presence of the RFS on the federal side may have impacted that in budget considerations as well. But again, nothing an interesting trend worth noting is when you're thinking about tax reform, but nothing locked in stone that, oh, this is absolutely what's going to happen. So can we go to the next slide, please? So, so going forward, when you kind of take all this in play, the factors that are going to, that they're going to, for tax reform and for renewable energy that you need to think about. There's the first fundamental question. Okay, is there going to be an incentive in the Internal Revenue Code to encourage the use of renewable energy? And, right now, the trend lines, the Democrats on the Senate Finance Committee have laid out a position that they want to continue to have some form of a renewable energy credit. There's also support among some Republicans to do that, but you also have others that, if you do that, though, that makes it more difficult to accomplish the other goal, which is reducing rates and to try to make the tax code more competitive and make the U.S. economy more competitive by reducing tax rates. So that's, without passing judgment one way or another on that, that's kind of the push-pull of that dynamic. So you've got that fundamental question of whether these tax preferences are going to survive. The last time Congress did tax reform in 1986, there was this very same dynamic. Tax preferences that were in the Internal Revenue Code, some survived, some didn't, and there are a whole host of factors that went into that. So that's the one very big question. And then, as well as, okay, so what are these incentives? What would these incentives be structured like going forward? Are they going to be long-term? Are they still going to stay short-term? We talked about the issue of refundability versus a general business tax credit. And then, are you going to have performance-based standards that, based on environmental performance, based on energy content? And then you can see that if you're going to have a renewable energy incentive in the tax code that's based on a performance-based, getting the devil truly would be in the details, and getting the details on that right would be hugely important to folks in the renewable energy space. So a lot to consider there. And again, I mean, when you look at the trend lines, you look at the desire of Congress where they're heading with this. Clearly, something this is the direction that the tax writing committees want to go. They definitely, not in terms of any specific goal about exactly how they're going to do renewable energy incentives, but tax reform is the longer-term goal. And as you're thinking about the future and you're watching what's going on in Washington, and when you're watching what's going on with these tax incentives, it's important to keep in mind these larger trends in terms of what's shaping the debate and what's formed, and how folks are moving forward. So with that, Susan, I think I'll wrap up my presentation and happy to take any questions anyone has.
Manning, thanks a lot. That was a fantastic presentation, and I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our audience did as well. We do have a few questions in the queue, and certainly we've got time for more questions. So just you can keep them coming. If you have things you want to ask or comments that you want to make, please send those along. Again, we'll share those anonymously, and Manning can respond to those. So Manning, one of the questions that's in the queue here, with tomorrow being basically the last day before the holiday, do you see anything that will be done in the House and the Senate before the Memorial Day holiday?
So again, right now it doesn't look likely. The Senate, as you noted, Susan, they're going to go out of the Senate's going to be out of session next week, and where things are right now is you've got, they tried to call up the extender package, they tried to have this cloture vote, it failed. So you've got these negotiations that are going on right now to determine whether there's an agreement can be reached in terms of what amendments can be offered and which ones will be considered that would mollify the Republicans to the degree that they would assent to allow that debate to move forward. Now, as we're speaking right now, they have not reached that sort of agreement. Some of the factors, I'll give you a little color and nuance on this. So, and I've talked about this before, you've got the larger issue of, the Republicans being upset about the change in the nomination rules, the Democrats being frustrated that minority party is, they allege that the Republicans are alleging the minority party's rights in this. But then when you get down to more of the specifics of the tax extender package itself, so you've got a bill that's extending current law provisions through 2015. On the specifics of it, and you saw this in the Finance Committee markup, from a germaneness perspective, the Democrats would want to try to limit amendments to provisions that directly affect expiring provisions, whereas you hear from Republicans that they will want to have a vote on provisions that not necessarily are expiring provisions, but they definitely impact the tax code. Most notable one that if you're following this in the press that you've seen is the medical device tax, which was one of the financing mechanisms that was included in the Obamacare Affordable Care Act, and is as an individual policy, there's actually pretty broad bipartisan support to get rid of it. But then again, you have the larger political dynamic of having what essentially could be portrayed as a vote on the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare on the Senate floor. So there are multiple layers that are that are impacting their ability to come up with some sort of an amendment agreement. Hatch and Wyden are still talking it through right now, but as we speak right now, they haven't reached an agreement. And if they don't reach an amendment agreement, which could be, which could happen, then they will move. At some point, Senator Reid will make the move to move off of that legislation and consider other business before the Senate. But like I said earlier, it's real important to remember, even if that happens, even if they're unable to reach an agreement, it's not the end of the road for taxes. It's not the end of the road for tax extenders, because there's plenty of precedent and plenty of ways that Congress can get it done. Does that answer your question, Susan?
Yeah, sure. It answers the question very well. So just a couple of questions that, just quick ones that are follow-on to that. Are there any current amendments being debated to include or preclude about the Keystone XL pipeline?
Now, see, that's a so the on Keystone, that was an issue that I referenced earlier in the presentation, talking about the energy efficiency bill that they were trying to bring up. And again, this is the you may have heard it referred to as the Shaheen-Portman bill, and it's a series of very bipartisan, broadly supported provisions that would that would encourage energy efficiency, as the bill's name implies. As part of that discussion, there were part of their attempt to come to an amendment agreement on that bill involved the Keystone pipeline, because you just had the announcement from the administration that there was going to be further deliberation on that, and so trying to find some sort of a way to have a vote on the Keystone pipeline got involved in that debate. They ultimately weren't able to come to an agreement and weren't able to get closure on the energy efficiency bill, and moved off of that. On this side of the ledger, on the tax extender package, it's more, I mean, kind of the nuance that, when you talk to Hill offices and you kind of trying to get a feel for what's going on with this is more of a, I mean, they want to have vote on some tax issues, the medical device tax being one that I specifically mentioned, and then, a more open amendment process that would allow for broader Republican votes. But Keystone is not, I mean, I don't want to underplay the importance of the Keystone issue. It's clearly a big political issue. It's clearly an important issue to a lot of members, but it's not as dominant on the tax extender discussion.
Got it. All right, a couple more here. You were talking about Camp's proposal and indicated that, there were a lot of incentives removed, and certainly, you listed off some renewable incentives. Are there similar cuts in incentives into any parts of the oil and gas sector that were also precluded as part of that proposal? Was it across the Energy Board, or was it more focused on renewables, or kind of what was the kind of tenor of that?
No. There were, every year the Joint Tax Committee will go and they will identify in the Internal Revenue, they will identify tax provisions that they call tax expenditures. Okay, so they will identify the cost of various preferences in the Internal Revenue Code, and they periodically will identify various oil and gas provisions. Camp's draft, it did retain one provision, but there were a whole host of other items that the Joint Committee had identified as oil and gas preferences that they would call for the repeal of. So if you're going to go through this and you're going to and you're going to try to get the rate down, particularly the corporate rate down to 25%, they really there were a whole host of preferences that they went after. Unfortunately, biofuels and renewable energy was one of them, but it wasn't the only one.
Understood. Yep. Okay, and another question here. In terms of the long-term reform, is there any chance for a revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend program?
Well, if I'm understanding the question right, one of the things when the Finance Committee, when Balkus was still the chairman before he went to China, one of the things that they asked when they put the discussion draft out and they asked for public comment on is one of the things that they asked for was public comment on the virtues of a carbon tax. And there is certainly a school of thought, and again, I want to be clear that I'm not, that I'm not advocating for this or discrediting it, but there is a school of thought that a more efficient way of encouraging clean energy, both on the fuel side and on the electricity side, would be to do a carbon tax of some form or function, so that you not only get the underlying policy goal of discouraging a behavior that you're trying to discourage, in this case a carbon tax, but also achieving the twin goal of raising revenue in a situation where, even if it's a revenue neutral package, it's going to be difficult to make the numbers add up depending on where you lower the rate to. So that noted, there are clearly a number of members who, for a variety of reasons, be it a philosophical opposition to tax increases, be it a more of a constituent-based concern in terms of how local industries would fare under a carbon tax, who have significant concerns with an approach like that as well. I'd expect it to continue to be part of the discussion. Like I said, the Finance Committee asked for comments on that. Nothing of that sort was included in Camp's draft, but it's something that I think it would be, am I going to sit here and say, oh, that's a lock to happen, or oh yeah, there's a high likelihood? Probably not. But I think it's not something that you can dismiss either.
Got it. Got it. Well, I think that was our last question. Manning, I can't tell you how much I appreciate such a great webinar and the content that you presented today. I think it was very, very educational and helpful, and kind of understanding not just what's happening in the near term, but kind of the long-term potential outcomes of things and what the current trends are towards that. So I would, you saw Manning's contact information, and you have my contact information here for everybody on the webinar. Really appreciate you joining today. Appreciate your questions. Certainly, if you have any follow-up you'd like to send to Manning or myself directly, please feel free to do so. We'll share the slides with the attendees today. Again, when you log off of the webinar, you may see a request for you to fill out a survey. If you have a few moments before your next engagement today, or before the next thing you do, please, we appreciate you taking the time, if you can, to fill that out, just to let us know, how we did today and how we can, make things better, or what you'd like to see in the next webinar. So, Manning, thank you very much. Any final comments?
No, thank you, Susan, for having me. I hope you got something out of the webinar. And as Susan said, if you have any follow-up questions or comments, or want to touch base with me afterwards, feel free to do so. My contact information is in the slide deck, or you can contact me through Susan. And Susan, thank you for the invite. It was my pleasure to participate.
Very good. Thanks, Manning, and thanks, everybody. Have a great day.